By the spring of 1944, the war in Europe had entered a critical moment. For years, Nazi Germany had controlled much of the continent, and millions of people had lived under occupation, waiting for the day when liberation would finally come. In England, however, another kind of waiting had begun. Across the countryside, in quiet villages and military camps, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers were preparing for a mission that few outside the military fully understood. Something enormous was coming, and everyone knew that when it arrived, history would change forever. To the outside world, the preparations looked like a massive military operation. There were endless lines of vehicles moving along English roads, aircraft filling the skies, and ships gathering in ports along the coast. But to the individual soldiers living inside that moment, it was much more personal. They were not thinking about history books or future victories. They were thinking about the people they had left behind, the uncertainty ahead, and whether they would ever see home again. Many of these men had been training for months. Some had spent years in the military, while others had been civilians only a short time before receiving their uniforms and orders. They came from farms, factories, schools, and small towns across America, Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations. They were not professional warriors who had spent their lives preparing for battle. They were ordinary people who had been asked to do something extraordinary. In the fields of southern England, temporary camps had become home. Rows of tents and military vehicles stretched across landscapes that had once been peaceful farmland. Soldiers learned the routines of military life: inspections, drills, weapons training, and endless exercises designed to prepare them for the invasion ahead. They practiced loading into landing craft, moving across beaches, and advancing against enemy defenses. Again and again, they repeated the same movements until they became automatic. But training could only prepare them for so much. No exercise could truly recreate what it would feel like to approach an enemy-held coastline under fire. No map could explain what it would be like to leave the safety of a ship and step onto a beach where thousands of weapons were waiting. The soldiers knew the risks. They had seen photographs of the German defenses along the French coast. They knew about the concrete bunkers, machine guns, artillery positions, and obstacles designed to stop them. The Germans had spent years preparing for an Allied invasion. Along the coastline of Western Europe, they had built what became known as the Atlantic Wall. It was a vast network of defensive positions stretching from Norway to the border of Spain. In Normandy, the beaches had been transformed into a battlefield before any Allied soldier had even arrived. Mines were buried beneath the sand. Wooden and steel obstacles were placed in the water. Concrete fortifications protected German troops overlooking the coast. For the soldiers waiting in England, these defenses existed mostly as photographs and briefings. They studied maps and listened carefully as officers explained the objectives. They learned the names of beaches they had never seen: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. They memorized routes and instructions. They prepared their equipment. They checked their weapons. And then they waited. The waiting was perhaps one of the most difficult parts of the experience. A battle has movement, action, and clear objectives. Waiting creates uncertainty. Every day brought the same questions. When would they leave? Where exactly would they land? Would they survive the first few minutes on the beach? Would the invasion succeed? Many soldiers found comfort in simple routines. They played cards, wrote letters, talked with friends, or shared memories of home. In these quiet moments, they were able to forget, even briefly, what was coming. They laughed together, told stories, and acted as if life was normal. But beneath those conversations was an understanding that everything could change very soon. Letters became especially important. Many soldiers wrote messages to their families before the invasion, though they could not reveal the details of the operation. Some tried to reassure their loved ones, saying they were well and confident. Others wrote more personal messages, expressing feelings they might never have spoken aloud. These letters carried the thoughts of men who knew they were about to face one of the greatest dangers of their lives. A soldier might carry a photograph of his wife or children inside his uniform. Another might keep a letter from his parents folded safely in his pocket. Someone else might carry a small reminder of home, a watch, a piece of jewelry, or a simple object with personal meaning. These small items connected them to the lives they had temporarily left behind. As May turned into June, the atmosphere changed. The excitement and anticipation of preparation gave way to something heavier. Soldiers began to understand that the moment they had trained for was finally approaching. The endless exercises, the months of waiting, and the uncertainty were coming to an end. Soon, they would leave England. Soon, they would cross the English Channel. Soon, they would face the beaches of Normandy. But before that moment arrived, there was still one final period of waiting, a brief moment of calm before the storm. Because on the other side of the water was a coastline defended by an enemy determined to stop them. And between the soldiers and the future of Europe stood one of the most dangerous missions ever attempted. For the soldiers waiting in England, the uncertainty that had surrounded them for months finally came to an end on June 5, 1944. After years of preparation and weeks of anticipation, the order was given. The invasion of Normandy would begin. The largest amphibious operation in history was no longer a plan on a military map. It was no longer a distant possibility discussed in briefings and training exercises. It was real. Across southern England, thousands of men received the news that they would soon move toward the coast and board the ships that would carry them across the English Channel. The reaction was different for every soldier. Some felt relief that the waiting was finally over. Others felt a quiet fear that they struggled to express. Many understood that they were about to participate in something that would define their generation, but they also knew that history was written by those who survived. The day was spent preparing equipment one final time. Weapons were checked and cleaned. Ammunition was counted. Uniforms were inspected. Packs were filled with everything a soldier might need once they reached France. Every item had a purpose, but every additional piece of equipment also added weight. The men knew that when they stepped onto the beaches, they would be carrying not only their weapons and supplies, but also the responsibility of the mission itself. For many soldiers, these final hours were strangely quiet. After months of intense preparation, there was little more training to do. The plans had been explained. The orders had been given. Now there was only time to wait and think. Some men sat together in groups, speaking softly about home. Others wrote final letters, knowing that the next message they sent might come from a battlefield rather than a training camp. Many soldiers did not know exactly where they would land or what they would encounter. Even among those who understood the broad objectives, the details of the operation remained carefully controlled. Security was essential. The Germans could not be allowed to discover the exact location and timing of the invasion. Soldiers knew they were going to France, but many did not know the full scale of what was about to happen. As evening approached, the atmosphere around the camps and staging areas changed. The roads that had been quiet became filled with movement. Military trucks carried men and supplies toward the ports. Soldiers walked through the darkness with their equipment, surrounded by thousands of others doing the same thing. The sound of engines, footsteps, and commands filled the air. For many, this was the moment when the reality of the mission truly began to sink in. They were leaving. The familiar fields of England, which had been their home during training, would soon disappear behind them. Ahead was the unknown. Some looked back at the country that had protected them and wondered if they would ever return. Others focused only on the next instruction, the next step, the next task. Sometimes survival depended on not thinking too far ahead. At the ports, the scale of the operation became overwhelming. Thousands of ships waited in the darkness, prepared to carry the invasion force across the channel. Landing craft, naval vessels, supply ships, and support ships filled the harbors. What had once seemed impossible was now gathered in one place, ready to move. Yet despite the enormous military force surrounding them, the soldiers waiting near the ships were still individuals. Each man had his own story. Each carried memories of a life before the war. A photograph tucked into a pocket. A letter folded carefully inside a bag. A promise made to someone back home. These small reminders mattered because, in that moment, they represented everything they were fighting for. The invasion was not only about territory, strategy, or military objectives. For many soldiers, it was about returning freedom to people they had never met. It was about ending a war that had already taken millions of lives. It was about making sure that future generations would not experience the same suffering. But ideals did not remove fear. Even the most courageous soldiers felt the weight of what was ahead. They knew that some of the men standing beside them would not survive the next day. They knew that the beaches of Normandy were protected by an enemy prepared to fight. They knew that once the landing craft approached the shore, there would be no easy way back. In the early hours of June 6, the invasion force began to move. The darkness of night covered the ships as they departed from England. Across the Channel, thousands of soldiers were heading toward Normandy. Above them, Allied aircraft moved through the sky. Behind them was everything familiar. Ahead was a coastline that would soon become one of the most famous battlefields in history. For those men, the journey had begun. The waiting was over. Now they had to face what they had been preparing for. As the invasion fleet moved away from the shores of England, thousands of soldiers entered a world of uncertainty. Behind them was the country that had sheltered and prepared them for months. Ahead of them was the coast of France, occupied by an enemy waiting behind a network of defenses built specifically to stop them. Between those two shores was the English Channel, a stretch of water that had separated Britain from the fighting on the European mainland for years. Inside the landing craft, the reality of what was happening began to feel much more immediate. The men were no longer training in the fields of England. They were no longer listening to briefings or practicing on quiet beaches. They were now moving toward the place where their training would be tested. The engines of the boat shook the steel around them, the sea moved beneath them, and every soldier knew that the next few hours would change their lives forever. The landing craft were crowded and uncomfortable. Soldiers sat close together, carrying heavy equipment and wearing the gear they would need once they reached France. Many carried packs, weapons, helmets, and supplies that added significant weight to their bodies. The space was limited, and the movement of the boat made the journey even more difficult. The smell of fuel, wet clothing, and seawater filled the air. The English Channel was not calm. The weather conditions had already delayed the invasion once, and the sea remained challenging. The boats rose and fell with the waves, making the crossing exhausting even before the fighting began. Many soldiers became seasick. Some struggled to keep their balance. Others sat quietly, conserving their energy and preparing themselves mentally for what was coming. For many men, this was the first moment when they truly confronted the possibility that they might not survive. During training, danger had always been controlled. Exercises could be repeated. Mistakes could be corrected. But now there was no practice run. The next time the ramp of the landing craft opened, it would not lead to a training beach. It would lead into combat. Some soldiers tried to distract themselves. They talked with the men beside them, shared cigarettes, checked their equipment, or looked out toward the dark horizon. These small actions helped maintain a sense of normality. In the middle of one of the largest military operations ever attempted, survival still depended on ordinary human habits: talking, helping each other, and staying focused. Others became silent. Many veterans later remembered the strange quiet moments during the crossing. Despite the enormous number of men and ships involved, there were moments when each soldier felt completely alone with his thoughts. The noise of the engines continued, the waves struck the boat, and somewhere ahead was the coastline they had been ordered to reach. They thought about home. They thought about the people waiting for them. They thought about the possibility that the next sunrise might be their last. Above the fleet, Allied aircraft moved through the sky as part of the enormous operation supporting the invasion. Thousands of planes would participate in the mission, carrying troops, attacking German positions, and protecting the ships below. The scale of the operation was beyond anything most soldiers could fully comprehend. Yet inside each landing craft, the war was reduced to a much smaller experience. A group of men. A small boat. A dangerous shore ahead. The soldiers did not see the entire invasion force. They did not see the thousands of ships moving together across the channel or the aircraft filling the skies. They experienced only their own small part of history. They felt the movement of the boat beneath them, heard the voices around them, and waited for the moment when they would finally reach land. As dawn approached, the darkness began to fade. The soldiers looked toward the horizon, searching for their destination. Slowly, the coast of Normandy began to appear. At first, it looked almost peaceful. A distant shoreline. Fields beyond the beaches. A landscape that seemed unchanged by the war that was about to arrive. But the soldiers knew what was hidden there. They knew that behind that coastline were German defenses, armed positions, and men waiting to stop them. The closer they came, the more the peaceful image disappeared. Smoke rose in the distance. The sound of naval guns grew louder. Aircraft moved overhead. The horizon became filled with movement. The invasion had begun. For the soldiers inside those boats, there was no longer any question about when the battle would come. It was coming toward them. The final minutes before landing were among the longest of their lives. Every soldier knew what was waiting beyond the ramp. They knew that when it opened, they would have to leave the relative safety of the boat and move forward into one of the most heavily defended coastlines in the world. There was fear. There was uncertainty. But there was also a determination shared by thousands of men moving toward the same objective. They had crossed the channel. Now they had to face Normandy.